All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar, The Importance of Closure. This is a webinar brought to you by the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series for September. And my name is Sarah Kremer. I'm Program Director here at Friends for Youth Mentoring Institute. And joining us on the webinar today are Mike Geringer from Education Northwest. He'll be monitoring the questions. April Reardon from the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota. April is kind of running the slides and helping us stay organized and on task. We also have Meg Ferns from Oregon Mentors, who's going to be monitoring the chat panels. And we have a few other people from the Mentoring Partnership of Southwest Pennsylvania, Mobius Mentors, and Indiana Mentoring Partnership, who are kind of rotating around and acting as satellites for today's webinar. So welcome to today's webinar. Just wanted to remind everyone that this is, this is a little bit of a different webinar than typical traditional trainings. Our webinars are unscripted and intended to be conversational and interactive. Some of that is functional because we're really pulling these together among a number of us every month, and it's a virtual process. We meet on our webinar from partners across the country, but mostly it's because we feel like the conversations that we have outside of meetings, at our cars, during breaks, or even over dinner at conferences and seminars, that's really what's important here, and that really makes the difference sometimes in some of our program practices. So we know that it's we're kind of a small field here, we're emerging, and we asked ourselves, how can we bring this small field together for shared learning and networking in a meaningful way? So that's our purpose here. I know some people have said in the evaluations that they're not sure about the process, or it seems like it's unscripted, and that's because it is. We also don't have any funding for this at this point, so that may be another reason why you're wondering why this isn't as tight as another training. So anyways, that's our spiel at the beginning. We're happy to have you here today. We had over 500 people register for this webinar. At this point we have over 300 on, and we're really excited to have you here. Today this is typical information that we usually have. You'll be receiving an email that have instructions on how to access a PDF of the presentation slides and the webinar recording after the webinar. That you can always go to the Mentoring Forums site to find that information. All of our webinars, the recordings and the slides, are posted at a central SlideShare account, and that's the link that you'll receive. And you can always go back and take a look at other previous webinars as well. We'll also be posting resources from today's webinar. We have a ton of resources from today too. Just everyone knows you're muted. Type in your questions and comments in the question box. Please respond to the polls, and we will be reading aloud Mike will be reading aloud your questions as we can get to them. So I know some people are already typing in questions. So please keep that up. But before we get started, we'd like to know who's with us today. So if you can take this first poll, just really quickly, how would you describe your experience level in the mentoring field? Beginner or new to the field? Maybe you're experienced. That means you've been working in the field for a while, you feel pretty comfortable with it. Or if you feel as if you're an expert, you've been in the field for long enough where you feel competent and qualified to call yourself an expert. So please go ahead and choose one really quickly. We do want to move on to today's webinar presentation. Looks like we've got almost everyone voting. I think this is our biggest webinar so far of the year. So here's what we've got. Like as in previous webinars, we have the majority of you, 69%, are experienced in the field, 22% beginners, and 9% experts. So fantastic. Thank you very much for doing that. And also would help us to know what your role is within a mentoring program. So if you don't mind taking this second quick poll please select one of the following. I work in a mentoring program, I am a funder, I'm a researcher, I provide technical assistance to mentoring programs, or something else. If you choose other, feel free to type in what that other is in the question panel, and we'll know what other means. So this looks good. We've got almost everyone going. Okay, here's what we've got. Look at that, 95% work in a mentoring program. I think that's our biggest percentage yet so far with programs. No funders, no researchers, and some technical assistance providers, some others. Do we have any comments on who these other people are? Mike, is there anything showing up there? Okay, well, if there is, Mike, I think you're on mute, so let's move on. Okay, so today we wanted to really talk about the importance of closure. When we were talking about this idea in general, we all decided that we wanted to present this at the beginning of the school year. A lot of programs are tied into a school calendar year, and we thought it would be great to start talking about closure at the beginning. So we're going to be talking with an amazing resource that we have in the youth mentoring field, Renee Spencer, about the importance, some different types of closures and endings, including when it is time for the match to end, as well as program responsibility for managing risks and benefits of closure. And then we'll kind of end with some tips and ideas for program coordinators. So that's our topic, and let's, I think we're ready to move on to, oh right, we wanted to let you know that in the spirit of closure, this webinar will end in 75 minutes. So we want you to do your best to make sure that you can be with us for that amount of time. We know that sometimes we don't have control over when you will be logging off or having to leave, so we want you to know that we are here with you for the next 75 minutes. A few things we wanted to talk about before we started discussing this topic, just some ideas that we were coming up with when we were brainstorming the idea. Don't rush to closure. That's really important to, not just use it as something quickly to turn to when things aren't working out. There are normal ups and downs in relationships. We want support, supervision, and monitoring to really play a key role in determining when it's appropriate to have some kind of closure. And also screening at the beginning to prevent early endings due to extenuating circumstances. We also kind of wanted to mention the idea, we're going to talk a little bit more towards the end about the idea of rematching. There's, it's funny, there's some contradictory information coming out now in terms of rematching. We know that rematching can work. Sometimes it's necessary and even beneficial. Sometimes staying in an ineffective match is a waste of time. Closure should be a process. It's not just an event. We want to emphasize that it needs to start at the beginning and last all the way through the relationship. We'd also like to emphasize that programs can model positive behavior and skills for the future by demonstrating how to end a relationship in a positive way. This also helps to keep all those good feelings that everyone got from that mentoring match to help keep that going without feeling disappointed in the very end. So, a few thoughts there to start off. And what else? What do we have next? April? We're ready to move on. I think we're ready to introduce our expert researcher here today, Renee Spencer. Renee is an amazing resource to the field, as I mentioned before. She's an associate professor at Boston University School of Social Work. She's done a number of really amazing qualitative studies that really look at what makes a mentoring relationship successful. She's written numerous articles and book chapters and serves as a member of several boards and committees. And we're really excited to have her here. So welcome, Renee. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm pleased to be here.
Excellent. Okay, so let's continue on in our unscripted way. We have a couple slides prepared before we start hearing from Renee too. We wanted to mention, and Renee was a contributor to this article on the ethical principles of youth mentoring that came out in 2002. We're really interested in making sure programs know about this information, making sure that they're really incorporating it into their program policies, but also thinking about each one of these principles, how they relate to closure. It's really important to remember that closure can be a part of each one of these pieces. Promoting the welfare and safety of the young person, being trustworthy and responsible, acting with integrity, that's a key point there. Promoting justice for young people and respecting the young person's rights and dignity. We'll go ahead and post either the article or link to the article up on mentoring forums to make sure that everyone has access to that. Okay, I think we're ready to move on here.
Is there anything Renee would like to add about the ethical principles at all?
Oh, that would be a good thing to ask, since you did help write this. Yes.
Well, I guess what I would say is that these are based on sort of ethical principles in other fields. So these are kind of ones that are generally agreed upon as things we ought to be concerned about when we're engaging in relationships that are intended to be helpful with other people. So whether that's a physician or a therapist, or, we make the case in this article, an adult who's being introduced into the life of a young person, that there are things we ought to keep in mind and ways we ought to hold ourselves and one another kind of accountable for those relationships. So we intended it to be useful for the field. I'm glad to hear you guys will post a link. When we put these things in these academic journals, they can be tough to access. But the article is really written with practitioners in mind.
Okay, great. And I found it enormously helpful, so I hope everyone else does too. So really, now we're getting into what we want to talk about today, endings in youth mentoring. We know that there's not enough attention, not enough research paid to closure in general. We wanted to really think about it in terms of, well, there's a lot about it in terms of theory, not much known about it in practice, although practitioners have amazing amounts of experience in this. Most of the focus, into helping programs start programs and sustain them are really about making and sustaining the matches as well, not really about the end. We have a quote here, a piece of research: most formal relationships do end, a third to a half end prematurely, and early endings are associated with decrements in youth functioning. So I think everyone's seen that amazing chart. I use that in mentor trainings myself to let people know that if you can't make the commitment, if you're not going to be willing to follow through, that it could end up being worse than if we had never matched that young person at all. So we feel like this is a very important topic here. So I think at this point we're going to move on and hear from Renee more about her research and her ideas in terms of closure. So Renee, go ahead and take it over. Oh, I'm not supposed to do that yet. We're still unscripted. And our next slide, we wanted to also look at this idea of different types of closure. Some of the things that we have here in our next slide. We can go there, April. Here we go. Planned, unplanned, relationship-based. So the ending happens because there's some problem in the relationship. Maybe it ends for non-relationship reasons. Someone moves, someone's work schedule becomes overwhelming. We also wanted to talk about the psychological versus physical impacts, and that's definitely where we wanted to turn things over to Renee to talk a little bit more, and we'll come back at the end with some examples of forms and other kinds of tools that programs can use to deal with all of these kinds of types. of closure. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Renee. So go ahead, Renee.
Okay, great. So I think just sharing here with you all a study. I've been working on a longitudinal study of mentoring relationships, so following at the time of match for up to 2 years in a community-based program. And there were 67 matches in this study. And what I'm showing here is sort of what happened to these matches. So you can see we're talking about 48 of them that closed, 48 of the 67 that ended before the end of the study, so ended before 2 years. The initial commitment was a year, so a good number of these lasted quite a long time. But then so of these 48 that ended, how did they end? And we really went in trying to go into this space that Sarah mentioned earlier about a real absence of discussion about this, at least in the research literature. I think there's the hope that these relationships last forever, and a bit of a reluctance, or maybe just kind of a blind spot in terms of thinking about the fact that these relationships, many do end. And so in this study, trying to take a look at how they ended. So as you can see, about 20 of them were, the ending was planned. That means that both the mentor and the youth knew that the end was coming, and there was some sort of exchange between the two of them, direct exchange, being an opportunity to say goodbye to one another. And that plan was, in fact, completed, meaning they made a plan and they actually carried through. Now, I should say of these 20 that some of these plans, we were pretty liberal in what we included in this group, meaning it might have been a very short notice planned ending, you know, a couple of days or a week even, and that varied anywhere from that to a couple months in some cases. Then there's this other group, the smallest group, where the ending's planned, but it doesn't really get carried out. So there's discussion of a way to have the mentor and the young person say goodbye to one another, some sort of plan made for that, but the plan just never gets carried out. And then in the last group, there is an ending not planned, and what I mean by that is there's no plan for the mentor and the youth to actually say goodbye in some way, shape, or form to one another, and the relationship ultimately gets ended by the agency. And this can be because the agency may have tried to engage both participants in trying to establish a plan, but that never got off the ground. It could be that one or the other of the either the youth or the mentor disappeared and they're really unreachable. So it's a whole host of reasons of why the agency would have to sort of come in and be the ones to formally end the relationship. In that last case, there's one of the two parties, either the mentor or the young person, that's the agency who's doing all of the communicating that the relationship is ending and why it's ending. So, you know, as we can see, again, of these 67, most of them did in fact end within 2 years, and it looks like saying goodbye is pretty challenging. And we hear this, I should say we did qualitative interviews with the mentors, youth, and the parents as well. And, you know, there's a lot of ambivalence about the ending of these relationships, and they can be challenging, I think. So I think that's part of why you see these endings that just sort of don't carry forth in the way we might like to see them carried out. And I think that means we've got a lot of work to do to provide matches with structure in terms of how to do that.
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine that most practitioners, since we have 95% of our attendees who work in mentoring programs, know this situation very well.
I'm sure. Seen lots and lots of examples of this, I'm sure.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk a little bit about when is it time to end the match. We had some ideas when we were brainstorming the topic of, you know, that there are lots of, we talk about closure as kind of one word, and maybe everyone's thinking about it as one specific kind of as situation. But when we really started to break it down, we came up with a lot of different kinds of ideas. That sometimes there's psychological distance, you know, where a mentor-mentee pair are really disengaged. Sometimes they're meeting, but they're not really forming a relationship. There's no real impact happening. Sometimes it's the formal end to, excuse me, a program when there's a time when they absolutely end and there's no contact past that. Sometimes it's when it's initiated by the mentor-mentee. Again, some of the kind of unplanned ideas that we were talking about. And then we also wanted to talk about the ideas of, what happens when you close too fast or too slow? Does that have any impact on young people or the mentors as well? And who really gets to decide when something is ended? And I know some of your research, you're going to get into a little bit more of that of who, when something has ended or closed, there may be other parties that don't really think that it happened that way. So Renee, maybe I'll let you talk a little bit more about some of those kinds of ideas.
Okay, so I think dovetailing on what you were just talking about, Sarah, again, in the study that I did, these were the reasons that these relationships ended, and some of these you've certainly touched on in your comments as well. The largest group was the life circumstances changed. The recession had a big impact. I was carrying the study out during that time. People lost their jobs. The mentors had to up and move someplace else, or they were doing double duty at work and found they just couldn't keep up the commitment any longer. So, there was a clear explanation for why the match ended. Then there was the other group in which it was pretty clear and pretty straightforward, which was the young person either just really, they had waited too long, and by this point they really weren't that interested in a mentor, that it wasn't a good fit for them. They thought they wanted to do this, they tried it out, and actually, thinking I'd rather spend a whole lot more time with my friends than do this. So, when the young people are dissatisfied, and I should say this, and again, I'm sure many practitioners have seen this, the youth will opt out early. They will, if they're unhappy with it, they'll sort of, we found at least in this study, sort of speak up and say, I'm out. Then another group that I think is really critical, I think in some ways these next two groups can be combined, where the mentor was unhappy with the relationship or how the relationship was going. Now in some of these cases the mentors did a nice job of ending it nonetheless, but they weren't happy. It wasn't what they expected. They weren't feeling like they were making a difference. They wanted out of the relationship. And then I think this other group of mentor abandonment would be those mentors who voted with their feet. So they're dissatisfied and they just sort of take off and become unreachable. And were a couple cases in the study where at the end the agency couldn't reach the mentor, the young person couldn't, and we couldn't for a while either. And we were pretty persistent. So in some cases we got some mentors a year after the match had closed and had an opportunity to talk to them. And in one of these cases in particular, I know there was a mentor who just didn't feel like she could do the ending, took off, and then felt really bad about it for quite some time. So I think a lot about the impact on young people, on the youth, when mentoring relationships aren't sort of ended well. But I think that's an example of where it can be difficult for the mentors as well, and we want people to want to be mentors and to stay invested in this. And then the last group is when, either the relationship kind of seemed to run its course, or one person was not as dissatisfied as in these other circumstances, but maybe, it was okay and the relationship was going along and getting along. And then difficulties with communication would just sort of take over. Sort of small things that other matches that endured would work through and find solutions to. In this group, it seemed like there just wasn't that much motivation to do it. Both parties were just kind of letting go of the relationship, if you will. And a few of these then were brought together by the agency and had a formal goodbye. But most of them, that the relationship, dissolved, and there really wasn't much communication between the mentor and the youth.
So Renee, this is Mike. I know we're going to be talking a little bit later about what programs can do in terms of handling different types of closures, but I wanted to just chime in. We had an attendee, Florence, who wrote in about kind of a unique closure circumstance. She works with foster care youth, and many times when the mentees become adopted, the social workers will want to close the match at the time of adoption. And she was wondering specifically kind of how to handle those types of situations, and that seems to be a little bit of a different circumstance. We talked earlier about like who gets to own the closure, and in this circumstance it's almost like there's somebody completely outside of the program and participants kind of weighing in on that decision. And I didn't know if that's something that you'd seen in any of your research.
I think that's a very interesting case and an interesting situation, and I can say I think what I've seen, I haven't seen that circumstance in particular, but I've seen things that I think are somewhat related in that there are assumptions about what would be the best thing for that young person, and then those assumptions get acted on. And then we have some examples, I think, of, well, from either the young person's perspective or the parent, because we interviewed the parent or guardian in this case. From their perspective, it wasn't necessarily, you know, the outcome that they were looking for either. So I would be real concerned about blanket policies like a child gets adopted, the mentoring relationship is no longer needed or should come to an end because maybe there's going to be conflict between the adoptive parent and the mentor. We need to let the kids settle in. I can imagine all sorts of really good reasons why this question would be on the table, but I would be concerned about blanket policies and sure want to see the mentor and the young person and all the parties that are going to be affected by this a part of a process of deciding what would be the best. Does the relationship need to be renegotiated, reconfigured in some way, take a break, have a planned time that you would return and get back in contact, or in fact end the relationship because it seems like the best thing to do.
Yeah, that reminds me of we've seen also in other programs too, when especially when it's a single parent, if a parent remarries, and who decides, you know, should that separate relationship with a mentor continue versus, you know, wanting to spend time with the new step parent, and the parents sometimes have different opinions about it than programs do. Mm. Yeah, very interesting. And, you know, I just want to take a step back to, Renee, did you get a chance to really explain your research and how, what were the reasons behind this research? I'm not sure that we kind of covered that. Do you want to take a few moments to explain that?
Oh, I mean, I'll say a little bit about it. So, okay. You know, what I'm focusing, you know, what I'm focusing on here in this context are these endings, and this was something we're able to do because we did this longitudinal study. The larger study was, you know, tracking relationships over time, trying to get a sense of how they develop, what seems to contribute to some relationships taking hold, others not, and, you know, sort of dissolving. And really the focus of the study is on kind of the processes involved in mentoring relationships and the impact on the different parties of the way that the relationship ultimately goes. So we tracked people at close intervals. We got them at the time the match was made, and then did an open-ended qualitative interview and had the participants complete a survey every 3 months in the first year of the match. And then if the relationship continued, every 6 months in the second year. So we didn't get every party at every time point, but when you put all of this together, you can really kind of piece together these relationships from a vantage point that's kind of different from any one. And I should add, too, that we were also able to look at the agency records or case notes on these matches. So sometimes we didn't have the end of the story from a mentor or a young person, but we had the case notes, so what the agency's last contact was. And so we really do have this unique vantage point, I think, on these relationships with all these different parties, and we're just really trying to make our way through it. And we decided to focus on this endings part first because we thought it was something that we could address more quickly than we can these larger issues of how all these relationships developed, in part. And then the other part is because I was just really interested in, you know, looking at sort of what happens on the other side. We talk a whole lot about matching and getting it right, putting people together, but then what happens at the end? And so that was really the focus of this study that I'm sharing some of the findings from with you all today.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry we didn't get a chance to do that earlier. So let's continue talking about what we see now as the relationship strength.
Yes, so we did then, based on their ending interviews, case notes, and then when we couldn't determine from that, we'd go back to some of the earlier interviews as well to try to get a sense of what was the nature of this relationship. Was this a strong match? Was it kind of okay? People were satisfied. Didn't seem like that much was happening, but it was fine. It was a perfectly good relationship. There were some cases where the relationships were more tenuous, so it just felt like one small difficulty or bump in the road might knock the relationship sort of off kilter. Usually it was the sense of they were at risk of ending, breaking apart in some way. The really interesting group to me, and I think this has implications for closure, is this out of sync group. And one of the things we saw overwhelmingly, and I'm sure the practitioners participating here today have seen this as well, and we hear a little bit in the literature, is just, the young people were overwhelmingly pretty darn satisfied with these relationships and pretty happy to have these mentors in their lives. And in contrast, a number of the mentors weren't that happy with the relationship, meaning, again, it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. It wasn't as much fun as they thought it was going to be. They didn't think they were making much of a difference, and they couldn't see. They really didn't know how much the kids seemed to be enjoying it. And so I think that's an interesting group. So we sort of, if you listen to the young person, you think, wow, this is a really strong, meaningful relationship. And then we'd listen to the mentor, and the mentor saying, I don't really feel that connected. There's not much happening. Those relationships were, we saw close. Those were ones that sort of would end up breaking, and largely because the mentor would sort of gradually disinvest from the relationship. And then there were these relationships that were weak, in that it just seemed like there was no connection was really formed. It was riddled kind of with problems from the start. And the reason why we ended up looking at this relationship strength, because we were wondering what might the connection be between this and how relationships end. And one of the things that we learned is that the strong relationships were the ones that tended to have these planned endings that got carried out. So, a way I think I'm thinking about this is the sense that if things are going well in the relationship and you've got two people that are kind of on the same page, then that match is likely to want to say goodbye, motivated to say goodbye, and probably, in some ways would feel a real loss if they didn't have that opportunity. In these other groups, it gets a little dicier, and I think it's these other groups that really speak to what a significant role agency support could play in these instances. Now, it's not to say that the strong relationships don't need assistance too. I don't mean to say that. But just these weaker relationships are the ones that were really struggling. There was often somebody who was avoiding saying goodbye, or somebody who didn't think it was really all that important. There wasn't the sense of investment of we really do need to say goodbye. And I can say from the youth and the parent interviews, from their vantage point, for many of them, even when the relationship was struggling, the young people overwhelmingly said, I wish I could have said goodbye. I really just would have liked to have had a chance to say goodbye to the person, even though, they might not have been hugely invested in it. So that was an interesting finding for us, looking at that connection between the strength of the relationship and then how, whether and how the mentor and youth were then able to, go through some type of a planned ending to the relationship. So Sarah, do you want me to talk about these other slides, keep going, or do you want to shift?
Let's see if we have any questions from Mike. If anyone's.
We have a lot of questions rolling in. A lot of folks kind of wondering how to handle specific closure scenarios and kind of what programs can do to kind of alleviate how it impacts the young person or the mentor when things close unexpectedly. So a lot of folks asking around, how do I handle it when the mentor's not available to be part of closure, or how do I handle it when it's the youth who's moving away? How do we keep the young person from kind of feeling guilty about that circumstance? So, and I know we have a number of slides coming up around program responsibilities around closure, so maybe we could move to those at some point here.
Okay. It's, I think it's interesting in all of our webinars, all of the planners of this are, we're all technical assistance providers. We're really fascinated with the research. And so we definitely want to address everyone's concerns, but I think it may help if we actually go back to a couple of Renee's slides where she has real case examples of what the differences are, because that will help us. And we decided to really use our own expertise here as technical assistance providers. We're all going to be chiming in to talk about ways for handling these kinds of situations in the program, like in practice, not just theory. But maybe, Renee, can you just briefly go over a couple of your, I know we have a couple slides of examples of actual case studies that that will help illustrate this?
Sure, kind of give you a sense. And again, I'm an observer, so
Yeah.
I do think it's really important to hear from folks who are out there implementing this. I have this particular vantage. I have the luxury of observing and not, having to have the full responsibility of doing something about all of this in the same way practitioners do. But I do think the cases are helpful. They provide some nice examples, and I think room to try to figure out some pathways through how to handle these kinds of closures. And I think I'll say, too, Sarah, I want to really highlight that point. I mean, the whole point of you all having this webinar at the beginning of the year, I think, is right on the money in the sense of how critical it is to really put the importance of closure front and center in program practices. So it means talking about it from the start, going in, that participants know if the relationship's going to end, these are the expectations for what should happen in an ending. Now, given that, you might have those expectations, and it still may be very difficult to get people to follow through. But I think talking up front about ending is really critical to sort of set the stage of how important it is to pay attention to this. So this first slide is really kind of our happy story of an ended, as happy as one can be about a relationship ending. But this was a very strong match. The ending was planned. The mentor applied and got into graduate school out of state, so had to move. And the mentor felt very connected to the mentee, as you can see from one of his description, a statement of his feelings. I love the little guy, and he too was sad. They were both sad to see the relationship end. But the mentor, because it, again, was going to graduate school, he had a good bit of lead time, and he took advantage of that. And actually, in this case, the mentor called the parent and asked the parent, here's the situation. I really want to make sure that we have an opportunity to say goodbye and do it well. You know your kid best. What are some of the things you think I ought to do to try to make this ending go as smoothly as possible? And the parent did give that mentor some advice and sort of talk about some things that she thought would be helpful. What the parent ended up doing was sort of planning things they really wanted to make sure they got to do before the relationship had to end, and they carried those through, and they had that opportunity to sort of say goodbye. So the things that they laid out and said they were going to do with one another, they carried and followed through with. And although this boy was very sad to see this relationship end, he was left with a clear understanding of how and why, and it was really the overwhelming feeling on the part of all parties was really just sort of disappointment that it had to end. It's just an unfortunate set of circumstances that the relationship had to end. So this is, I think, in many ways kind of the best case scenario.
And so, and can I just add, and
Sure.
It doesn't seem like it impacted anybody's feelings about the relationship itself.
No, it was really more leaving with very good feelings about what had happened, what had transpired, and what a role the relationship had played in both the mentor and the youth's life, and in the life of the family, actually. And again, just the disappointment that this good thing was having to come to an end, unfortunately.
Okay, great.
So then this other example is, not such a pretty story. It's again a strong relationship, and again a planned ending. But unfortunately, it remained difficult for the young person nonetheless. So it was a strong relationship. They were able to say goodbye. But this was a vulnerable young person who had had a number of losses in his life, and this was just, yet another one. This was also a young person whose first mentor had abandoned him, so gotten matched, had a relationship, kept going, and then the mentor just disappeared. So in this case, the mentor wasn't disappearing. They knew that he had to move, and this was one of the mentors who had to take this job in another part of the country, but it was nonetheless very difficult for the young person. And we got a sense of this most from the mother, where the mother describes her son, keeping up the good face in front of the mentor, but then when the mentor left, showing his true feelings about how heartbroken he was by this. So the first abandonment was difficult, and unfortunately, the end of this relationship seemed to serve to just reinforce those feelings. So. This is very difficult in the sense of, so then what do you do? Here we have, folks who planned an ending and carried it out, and it was still pretty challenging. And I'm not sure, and some program folks, again, may have some ways that they manage this, but it sure seemed like there was a need for maybe some follow-up with the family and with the child, some kind of additional support. It wasn't clear to me what the plan was going forward for this child, the child saying, I don't want to do the program anymore, but what might be able to be done with that? Are there some ways forward? This is, I think, one of the really challenging circumstances that can arise. Mm-hmm. Everybody does their best, and it's still just very difficult for that young person.
Okay, yeah, let's keep going with some of your examples. These are great. People are adding in some questions, but let's get through all of these first, and then we'll take some more questions.
So let's see if we can move forward then to. I think there's one. That's
the weak match.
Weak match, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If we go to that one. So this was, an example of a weak relationship. The ending was planned in the sense that the mentor and the parent communicated, and the mentor said, I can't do this anymore. I need to no longer be a mentor to your child, and so they knew that it was going to come to an ending. But then the mentor had a really difficult time being clear about that in their final meeting. There wasn't much planning or lead up to it, so from the young person's perspective, they went out on a regular meeting, and in the context of that meeting, the young person found out that that was their last meeting, which was, I think, quite surprising to her, and I think not a good idea to take that kind of an approach. The other piece of this is the mentor appeared, again, from both the parents and the child's report, seemed to have left it a little bit fuzzy. I mean, there was a sense of, we're going to keep in touch, and I'm not going to see you as much or as often, but, it's been great, and we'll keep in touch. And at the time of the interview, which was a little while after the relationship had ended, the young person still wasn't really sure. Is it just the official relationship that ended? This mentor had said that she would contact the young person, but had not at the time of this follow-up interview. And so the young person was still, the youth was left with some real lack of clarity about sort of what had happened, what was going to happen going forward, and I think in part because of this kind of fuzzy approach to the ending, which I can, as somebody who personally finds it difficult to say goodbye in my own relationships, I can see myself doing something like this. It's sort of like trying to gloss over how difficult it is to sit on, across the table from a child, and say, we're not going to continue this relationship anymore. And this is where I think mentors need a ton of support in terms of, how to carry out a good ending, and being prepared for how difficult it may be for them to face-to-face, say goodbye to this young person, but how important it actually is to do so.
This makes me think about, I wonder if this mentor received any kind of training up front around here are ways to close the match. I would guess, it sounds like maybe not. Of course, we all have had experiences with volunteer mentors who receive tons of training and don't seem to retain any of that knowledge that we were trying to pass on. But I think as an example of someone who either didn't pay attention to that training or didn't receive it.
Or it's, I think this is one of those areas where if you of course I would say goodbye. Of course I would end my relationship well. And then when you actually get in kind of the murky circumstances, it can be more challenging than you might have imagined at the outset. And I think that can sometimes play a role. I think training's critical. What I sort of gleaned from, absolutely critical. And what I also gleaned from listening to these matches was just the need for ongoing support. And I know oftentimes there's less of an interest in sort of supporting that from funders and in all sorts of arenas. There's a lot of attention to making those matches. But boy, it was really clear that these relationships, could use a lot of help in saying goodbye. Saying goodbye is a very difficult thing to do. I think that's one of the other sort of big takeaways from this. And then here's this last example of the planned and not completed, kind of classic of everybody knows that there's the relationship is ending and there was a plan to say goodbye, but then it never got enacted. So the mentor was supposed to call the young person, didn't, and so they never actually had the chance to say goodbye to one another. So although everybody knew it was ending, there wasn't this kind of formal opportunity to say goodbye. And this quote, I think, is so poignant, and we heard the kids say this, of wondering if they caused it. Is the mentor leaving because I did something? Is it that in this case, I don't think he likes me no more, he left without saying, he just left without calling. So I think it's one of the vulnerabilities of young people is, you know, when they don't understand what's happening in a relationship, they're all too quick to take responsibility for it and wonder what they did to push an adult away in that sense. And so, again, one of the real consequences, I think, of not having that chance to say goodbye. And then, so yeah, you were going to go on to the strong match. This is one of these relationships that, oh, this one has just stayed with me, I have to say, because this was a really strong match. But it's a match where the young person was moving into adolescence, and so the structure of the relationship wasn't working as well anymore because the young person was playing sports and wanting to spend a whole lot more time with friends, and the mentor began to perceive that as a lack of interest in the relationship. And so he said, hey, this, you know, seems like not such a thing anymore, so, you know, I guess we're good, and, you know, we can leave it as it is. You know, it's been great knowing you, kind of thing. The mentor conveyed to the agency that he thought that this should be the case. The parent, again, the young person was in the loop and sort of went along with this. The mentee kind of went along with it, and all right, yeah, if it's ending, it's kind of ending. And the parent was the one in the background who was sort of saying, oh, I really hate to see this person go. This was a boy, this family had lost the father. He had died, and although the mother was in a new relationship and headed towards remarriage, the mother thought that this particular mentor was playing a very distinct role in the boy's life and different from other men, like uncles. You know, she said to me, he has lots of supportive people in his life, you know, that are around, and that's great, but they don't focus just on him in the way that this mentor did, and she really wanted to see it continue. In talking to the kid, too, I had the sense of this is, I think, an opportunity for when a relationship seems not to be working. I think one of the points Sarah made early on is not being too quick to close a relationship. When a relationship doesn't seem to be working, can it be reconfigured in a way that does work? In this case, again, I got the sense that the mentor felt like he was quite helpful in making a difference early on, and as the boy's attention turned to different arenas, didn't think he was making much of a difference. But it looked to the parent, and from, again, me as an observer, that he in fact was, but it just was taking a very different form at that point. And, you know, I just have been left with the feeling on this one of, could this relationship been renegotiated? And that was what the parent was left. She really had the sense of, you know, I think something could have been done to save this.
Great. It's making me think of lots of examples here, but also the idea of if you know, a mentoring program spends so much time conceptualizing what mentoring means to them, and really kind of coming up with, this is our definition of mentoring, here's why it's important to us. Does the program have a responsibility, you know, an ethical responsibility to that young person to be able to change some of their guidelines if it's going to benefit that young person? Mm-hmm. So maybe it's, you know, maybe if the meetings aren't happening as frequently as it's required by the program, can the match still continue because it's better for the young person, even though they won't be meeting the number of hours that they require? It's just, you know, more questions than answers, I think, here.
Yes, yes, indeed.
So speaking of questions, sir, we've got a few interesting ones come rolling in here from the audience. One thing that there seemed to be a cluster of questions around the idea of rematching after closure, and some different scenarios. Carrie wanted to know specifically, Renee, if you know, how do we tell young people if they're not going to be rematched for whatever reason? They've aged out of kind of the age range of the program, or there's some other circumstance where they won't be rematched. Do we run the risk of adding kind of a double hurt? Not only did your match close, but we're not going to be providing you with a new mentor, and how to handle that conversation. Also, Esther wanted to know if there are kind of metrics or scales or indicators that might say, you know, this young person probably should be rematched, this young person maybe not. Any thoughts around those?
Oh, these are great questions, and to the latter one, how I wish, you know, that there were scales and measures, you know, wonderful tools that could be used. And at this point, I'm not aware of any, although Sarah might be. And in the first case, you know, yeah, I think that's an incredibly difficult position to be in, and I, you know, from my vantage point, don't have great answers to that. But Sarah, I don't know if you do, given your vantage point.
No, I don't think I know of anything that, you know, is an official, you know, a valid and reliable tool that that anyone, Mike or April or Meg, have you heard of any? I mean, I think programs seem to decide, you know, kind of try things out on their own and make decisions based upon their, you know, intuition and previous experience. But I don't know of anything. Does anyone else? You heard of anything?
No, I had an interesting conversation with somebody that runs a program in North Carolina a while back, and theirs is a school-based mentoring program. It's designed to be multi-year. I mean, many of their matches stay together for a decade as the child moves through the school system. And they said they only do matching like twice a year, and if a young person's match ends kind of unexpectedly, they wait. They don't do rematching right away. They've got other kind of services and program components that the child can participate in, but they don't immediately assign them a new mentor. And part of the reason of that is that they want to give the young person time to process what has happened and, you know, kind of think about their participation moving forward in the program, and to kind of just let that wound, if there is one, heal a bit. And so I wonder if some of the issues we have around rematching sometimes aren't just due to kind of this pressure of like, oh, you know, we want to get you rematched and get you back on track right away, when maybe the more prudent thing would be to take some time and let the child, you know, kind of get to a place where they're ready for a new mentor.
I think this is April, and I guess one of the things that kept coming up for me when I was thinking about this and all of the different policies that you come up with is just to make sure that they're youth-centered, that you're thinking about what is going to benefit that young person the most. So if rematching feels like it's a good thing for them, to do it to benefit that young person and not being so program or system centered, or sort of we want to keep our matches going. I think that's what some programs run into sometimes, is that pressure to keep the number of matches up. Mm-hmm. And you know, maybe that's not the best reason to be rematching.
Mm-hmm. I think, well, it reminded me of one of the tools. I wouldn't even call it a tool, but it's an idea that we use in our program. Kind of comes from, and I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe this is a West Coast thing, but I had heard as I was growing up in my 20s about the breakup rule, that you want to, after you break up with someone, a significant other, a partner, that you want to wait at least half the amount of time you were with that last person before you start dating again. Which is a little ridiculous when it gets too long, but but it's that idea of giving yourself time, and that's we've kind of adopted a little bit of that idea, so that if a young person or a mentor is going to be rematched, we will wait you know, a significant amount of time before rematching them, to give them a chance, like Mike was saying, to heal, to process whatever they need to do before they meet the new person. And I think that's really true for mentors too, because mentors often bring everything that they experience with that first mentee, and that's not always it's never a good idea in any kind of relationship, but it's very tough for those new mentees to live up to someone else's expectations.
Sure. You know, we had a very interesting question early on in the webinar that I want to make sure we come back to. Catherine wrote in and talked about the use of parents' enclosure processes, and she said that in her program oftentimes parents will want to kind of break the news around the match ending themselves, and in their program they kind of, you know, coach the parent a little bit on how to have that conversation and prepare the parents. But I haven't really heard of that kind of use of parents in kind of breaking that news, rather than having it come from the program or the mentor themselves. Any thoughts from the group about using parents or different ways we can use parents to facilitate closure?
Well, this is Sarah. I'll just say I think it's a great idea when it seems like it's appropriate. From Renee's example, it seems like that was a really that was a strategy that benefited that young person. But I could also imagine there may be instances where it would not.
Yeah, this is Renee. I certainly would think that a conversation, if it's the mentor who's ending the relationship, or if it's the parent, who's decided they want to put it in, that a conversation between the agency and the parent about how this is going to get handled is pretty critical. I do think that parents should be central in planning, and then in that process, what comes out in terms of who the best person to break the news is, as it were, seems like it's just such a case-by-case sort of consideration. But I think parents can be very valuable resources in helping think some of that through.
And hopefully that's being set up from the beginning, where parents are made to feel like they're part of the team, that it's not just that they're being consulted at the very end, but they've been involved all along. And I would even say, maybe think about your example again, Renee, of the planned, and everyone had a pretty good feeling about the actual relationship. I wonder how much the program had to do with that ending as well. The mentor took the step of calling the parents, but was the program involved in that? It's hard to say. And if it continues past a formal end, that's one other idea we were talking about as we were planning this webinar. Sometimes programs have formal endings, meaning that they're not connected to the program anymore, but sort of leave it up to the mentor, mentee, and parents or guardians if they'd like to continue, and that's really up to all of them to decide, what does that closure look like as well.
Or maybe, this is April, just to be thinking about, maybe not just parents, but who are the other adults in that young person's life, depending on the type of program you have. Is there a probation officer? Is there a teacher, an aunt, a sibling, like somebody else who's significant who can support them after that ending? Of course, this is ideal. This is, in that plan scenario where the mentor would be contacting them, but it might be good for the program to know that as well in case there is that unanticipated ending, and to be able to prepare this other adult to support them through that. Because I think what we were thinking about is, like, it's nice to think about all the things that you can do when you anticipate the ending of the match, but what about all the things that, is there any reason you can't do some of those things, which we'll talk about in a minute, but some of those things, even if it is unplanned, just using other adults and using your program staff.
This is Renee. These are great points. And I would just add, Michael Karcher, another researcher in the field, is a real advocate for taking the opportunities to say goodbye when you've got them, meaning even in school-based mentoring programs where the relationship's going to continue into the next year, he really advocates for having a goodbye for the end of that year, and to say, well, our plan is to see each other again, but what if something were to happen and we're not able to do that? Let's take stock and have a chance to sort of say goodbye now, and then, we'll begin again next year. And I think a similar sort of logic to this, we're going to stay in touch sort of scenario, I think it's confusing for young people. And so when that's the intent, I think it's important for mentors to understand they really do need to carry that out. I think sometimes that can be thrown out as a way to sort of make themselves feel better about the relationship ending, or if they're the ones that are ending it, sort of saying, oh, but I'll be around and I can support you. That it really needs to be clear that the formal mentoring relationship has come to an end, and there's a goodbye process involved with that. And if there's any plan for contact going forward, some initial structure of what that might look like. Oh, you're going to keep in touch. Well, when might the next time you contact one another be, and what might that look like? Because this sort of left to whatever, whenever, again, I think it's really difficult for the young people.
Absolutely. And I realize that we had one more example of yours that we didn't really cover, and that was the weak relationship, or the ending not planned, which is unfortunately something many of us are all too familiar with, of the mentors who just sort of disappear off the face of the earth. So do you want to just cover that really quickly, and then we'll get back into what we've been talking about? even though I know we don't want to talk about this one at all.
Right. These are the most distressing. Oh, these are
Yeah.
so upsetting. And when you go back and when we would go in and then talk to the young person and the parent, and so distressing. So I mean, unfortunately we see this scenario. Folks participating here today, I'm sure have seen it all too often. Is the mentor that disappears, and the quote from the participant, "We just never heard from her again." The classic case too of the kid should be calling me. I've made enough of an investment. It's time to get a little bit back, which is really can be a very unrealistic expectation of a young person, and so that this ended in this kind of abandonment way. It's kind of how I think about it, and both the parent and the young person, feeling pretty darn upset about it. I'll put a plug in here too for exit interviews, for agencies to do exit interviews, because we were just really bowled over by, and to do those with parents as well. We were bowled over by what parents could tell us about the process, their observations, and also, we have some matches where there are just some pretty different stories about what happened in the end, and I think that could be really informative for programs as well, of sort of what were people left, what's their construction of what happened in the end, and then working backwards and thinking about what could be done to get greater clarity in these situations. But all too often we don't know what happened after. Well, they're ended and we're done, and end of the story.
Great, and I see April has focused on, and she's definitely
I'm
writing.
really bad at it.
That says parent, for I can read her writing via webinar. Exit interview with mentor, mentee, and parent or guardian. I think that's really, a great suggestion there. These are what's showing up on the slide are the standards from the 3rd edition of the Elements of Effective Practice regarding closure. And as we were, maybe I'll transition into talking about some tools and processes as what programs are responsible for. There are lots of examples of things out there, but we also found that there weren't a lot of great guidelines in terms of, here's what you do. You see that in the Elements of Effective Practice, very few suggestions, lots of examples of forms, but no real sense of like when should you use them and how do you handle this whole idea. And it makes me think about, Renee, I love how you say in a lot of your talks is that mentoring relationships are real relationships. They're just, they're ups, there's downs, they're messy, they're wonderful, but nobody likes saying goodbye, and that's really, really difficult for mentors, I think, who a lot of them want to get involved to make a difference, and they aren't thinking about how closure can also be part of that. Maybe because they think, well, we'll just be friends forever. So it's we could talk about this for probably 6 hours on a webinar, but it's really interesting ideas that we've been coming up with. So, and what April is showing right now is we were looking around for some ideas about, in terms of, this might definitely work with planned closures, like if it's the end of the school year or end of the formal commitment, to think about some kind of celebration or ritual, something that mentors and mentees can do together with support from the program to really be able to say goodbye and think about ways to hold on to all the positive feelings that they gained and all the great experiences they had, and also be able to let that go. So we'll put up some examples on the Mentoring Forums page. We have a couple reflection tools. We've got some ceremony ideas. I think we have one from Mike Karcher that we'll be able to put up there. And to also encourage programs to think about being able to use some of these kinds of ideas even if the ending was not planned, so that young people can retain a little bit of that as well.
Yeah, and I think in looking at, so we had, like we said, approaching 600 people registered for the webinar, and we did ask, kind of, do you have questions or even just innovative ideas, and somebody had shared that scrapbooking as an idea for mentors and mentees to do, but but some of these things, but there were a lot of folks who were just looking for ideas about how to do closure, period, and so. Yeah. For some of us, you might feel like, oh yeah, well, you could do a ceremony or you could journal or something like that. But wanting to, highlight those and think these might be new ideas to people who are just ignoring closure altogether, or who haven't done that at all, and it just sort of ends, or not really thinking about how important it is. So we've got a ton of people on here, and in most experienced, but some beginners though too, and to think about how to do that. One of the things that came up for me too is where to look for ideas, and kind of like the ethical principles, we're looking at similar fields. I just started thinking about where are the places in our lives where we have planned endings for relationships. So with my background in summer camp, so that's where kind of the friendship bracelet, or to think about how counselors start to prepare for that last meeting. So if you do have that kind of cycle where matches end, or if you know that something is going to end. But then also I started thinking this week about foster care and foster parents, and looking for ideas there. But it looks like from what I could see, they're struggling as much as we are on how to end. It's just weird how to end those relationships. But the other thought that I had just about this slide, and looking at some of the examples that we found, other than, there's the ceremony, but to think about journaling or artistic expression or scrapbooking or writing a poem, and not to be stereotypical, but my question would be, I wonder how this varies by gender maybe, or even by age, and what's going to resonate with male mentees or male mentors. Like, how do they say goodbye? Not saying that none of them could use some of these things, but are they as appealing as ways of saying goodbye?
Are you suggesting that boys and men would not be making friendship bracelets, April? Is that what
I'm suggesting that
here?
I'm actually suggesting that some boys and some girls might not be interested in that way of expression or reflection. So I don't know, Mike, if you have experiences from Youth Build then too, where you might have some older youth or thinking about how they've closed those relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I love friendship bracelets, so...
okay. We have a point for friendship bracelets.
I'm glad that the age issue came up. Ryan has asked a couple of questions throughout the webinar around handling closure and peer mentoring programs. A lot of the conversation today has been around, we have adults that have lives and things happen in their lives and matches close, but I'll just throw this out to Renee and the rest of the panel. What are your thoughts around handling closure in peer mentoring relationships where, there may be two parties that kind of need some help processing feelings around that, and a little bit of coaching around how to reflect on it. Any thoughts from the group?
Well, this is Renee. Mike, I think you hit the nail on the head there with that sense of two people needing sort of support and coaching in this. I think it's one of the things we've learned about peer school-based mentoring with peers as mentors, is that you got to provide a lot of support and structure for the mentors in those kinds of circumstances. And I think closure would be a really important aspect of that. And I can imagine you would indeed need to really support and coach both parties in that kind of ending.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add to that. I don't know if any of us.
I'm seeing a lot of good suggestions in the questions field here. People recommending the use of worksheets that have things, like sentence completion, like I value you because of this, and different reflection tools, and certainly we'll be sending some of those around and sharing those with participants today. But lots of good suggestions coming in the questions as well.
This is April, and I had unfortunately, I led a cross-age mentoring program, so it was older youth with younger kids. But what I'm thinking about right now is, I think we did some closure sort of the end of the year, end of the school year. But it just raised an interesting question because it was in a really small town, so you can't really, it's hard to just say we won't have any contact, because when you're in a rural area or in a smaller community, you just run into each other at at the football game or at the store. And so I'm actually just thinking we probably didn't do a very good job of figuring that out, but it was more about monitoring what kind of contact should they have afterwards, and having them agree to that. And actually then in both cases, having both sets of parents agree, the mentor's parents and the mentee's parents. And for the cross-age mentoring, to make sure that the mentor's parents understood the boundaries and sort of what was expected of that mentor, because the kids I was working with, the teens who were mentoring these younger kids would, I mean, they just fell in love and became very committed and would sort of spend time or sort of go overboard with their kids at the expense of their own homework or their own activities or their own well-being and that sort of thing, which, you know, we're trying to prevent those early endings, and so we wanted to have them take care of themselves first and foremost. So that became an important part of that. I haven't thought about that in a long time, so that was a great question.
You know, it also makes me think about, I've been doing some training for some AmeriCorps programs where AmeriCorps members are serving as mentors, either officially or sort of unofficially, where they take on a mentoring role to a number of youth, kind of having like a caseload. And most of those AmeriCorps members are recruited from the community, so they've lived there and they will continue to live there after they've been AmeriCorps members. And so what's that ongoing relationship going to be after they've finished the program, but they still see all of those kids that they've been meeting with and forming these hopefully really strong relationships with. Last year at the end of our year, we were talking about closure and the need to really close the relationships, at least within the program, so that the young people don't sort of feel abandoned because they don't know why their mentors aren't calling them anymore, or just, you know, kind of leave it up to, well, just call me whenever you want, and then not really thinking about, well, if you continue in this program again another year, you're going to have 20 more young people, and then your caseload is going to be 30. You know, can you really manage that? So it brings me back to the idea of just helping everyone being able to know that you need to be able to say goodbye from the beginning, and have that expectation really in place for everyone to understand.
This is a little bit different.
With that being said,
go ahead. Oh, this is April. I was just going to add something to that.
Okay, but as a time check, we have 5 more minutes, and in 5 minutes, our relationship will be ending for this webinar. Go ahead, April. There's a mentoring program here that I participated in their training, and they always talk about the no-fault match, you know, or the no-fault ending. Kind of, Minnesota has no-fault auto insurance, and so what it really lets the mentors sort of know from the beginning, we know stuff happens, you know, or, you know, going like some of these scenarios like Renee has shared, to be able to share those and upfront with mentors so that they even have a language for how to talk to their program coordinator about what's happening if they are thinking about ending it. And same for the mentees though too, but it made me think of it because I felt like it was especially important with young mentors, those high school students, or even, you know, think about AmeriCorps or typically, not always, but sometimes younger, but to not necessarily know how to tell somebody that it's not working or that something else has come up. So I appreciated Renee's honesty about that. Might be the way I did it, where you would say, well, no, we're still going to hang out. It's going to be fine. And but yeah. Well, I think we've all been there. So these are real relationships. Any last couple of thoughts, Renee, as we're ending our time here?
You know, I'm just so delighted to get to be a part of a conversation about this. I think we need to be talking a whole lot more about closure and thinking collectively and trading ideas, like has happened today, and sounds like we'll continue with the resources you guys are making available to people. I think it's such an important issue, and I think, you know, I think if we get better and better at this, that I think it will be of a real benefit to the mentoring field, because I think we'll see the impacts of mentoring improve when we handle endings well. I think it's that critical. I'm just so glad that you all did this webinar, invited me to be a part of it.
Great. Well, we've been so excited to have you be a part of it and to share your expertise. It's really exciting to see the research that you're doing get out there, because you are talking about really important parts of not just, you know, getting programs started and getting everything launched, but what do you do what do you do when things have to end as well? Any other last thoughts from any of our panelists, from April, from Mike, from Meg?
Well, I just wanted to say, I think people have been writing in the questions with a number of great kind of specific ideas, and I think maybe we can kind of gather these up and post them on the forums later. Things like planting a tree in a community park is a way of kind of leaving a lasting memento of the relationship. All kinds of specific ideas around little mementos, trinkets, things, photo collages, that type of thing. But we still are getting a lot of questions, and I don't know if we'll be able to answer them all today, but how to handle those catastrophic match failures when the mentor really flakes out. And I kind of come back to those ethical principles we started with. I mean, I think what's most important is to make sure that the young person does not shoulder the blame or feel like they are responsible for that, and to acknowledge that they're going to have, maybe some anger about it, some conflicting feelings about it, but trying to teach the young person that, relationships will end throughout their life, and that, these things, even if they're painful, can be learning experiences, and you can learn what your own personal strengths and kind of weaknesses and things to improve are when we face challenging times. So, the best we can do to turn those kind of catastrophic failures into a teachable experience, I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it reinforces my personal belief in the value of a mentoring program is to help a young person understand and experience a supportive relationship so that they know they can have more of them in the future. And to really be open to that, they need to have a positive, as positive as possible of a closure with that first relationship. All right, so April, any last thoughts? And I know you're going through some great slides here on our next webinars coming up, which I'll mention in a moment. Any last thoughts on closure?
I think you said it well. You both said it well, and I guess there's no reason we can't ask those questions next month as well to this collection of experts as well.
Great. And do you want to say something about the next month's webinar?
Or Mike, do you want to
April or
mention
Mike,
that?
I know you're working on this.
Yeah, so next month we've got a very special event that I'm excited about. We're going to have 3 very prominent researchers from public-private ventures on to talk about their long history of kind of researching mentoring programs, and kind of really they have laid the groundwork for much of this field. For those of you that don't know, PPV closed down, I believe, in July. And we kind of wanted to have Wilson Good, Carla Herrera, and Jean Grossman on to talk about kind of the legacy of their work. Certainly they are responsible as much as anybody for the growth of the modern mentoring movement and kind of a lot of what we know about best practices in mentoring. So we'll be talking about the history of their research, but we'll also be looking forward and kind of picking their brains around what they think current trends are in the field and what researchers need to be looking at for mentoring moving forward. So it should be a very an interesting look back and an interesting look forward. So hope you can join us.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And just as a closing, also to remind you that you'll be receiving an email that gives you a link to be able to access the PDF of the slides and the webinar recording, which will be posted. We're getting it up there pretty quickly. It may not happen right away, but you'll see it very soon, as well as a link to the mentoring forums, where we'll be posting some other resources and a place to continue the dialogue. But please help us out by, there's a very short survey that will pop up when you end the webinar. Please help us out by answering those questions. And on behalf of everyone who's part of the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much, Renee, for sharing your research with us and your thoughts.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure.
Great. And thank you, Mike and April and Meg, for supporting us in the webinar today. And we look forward to seeing all of you next month.